In today's episode, we'll tackle Germany's last-ditch offensive to win the war in the West, the Battle of the Bulge.
Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. Hi, Jesse. Here we are again, another week, another podcast. So this time we're going to the end of the Second World War, and we're looking to the Western Front, as I already said, the Battle of the Bulge, this really famous German offensive, as I just said, the last attempt to perhaps win the war in the West, or whatever they tried to achieve with this offensive, something that, of course, we're going to analyze here in our podcast. I'm assuming we're going to do what we always do. So we start quite big. We look at the context. We look at the strategic setting before we then zoom in, look at the opposing forces and what actually happened on the ground in late 1944. So, Jesse, late 1944, what is the situation like on the Western Front?
Well, as you can imagine, the situation is not good in the fall and early winter of 1944 for the Germans. In fact, this is why they decide to launch the Battle of the Bulge in the first place, which starts in December, just so we orient ourselves for any of you listeners or viewers out there who haven't thought about the Battle of the Bulge in a little while. So, essentially, Germany's in quite bad shape. By about September 1944, the Western Allies have made it more or less to the German border in the West. And the Soviets by October have reached the German border in the East. Not everywhere, but in the northern parts and East Prussia. So they're also knocking on the door. One of the other problems for the Germans is that 1944 is the year where they've had the highest losses so far. So they've lost more men, they've lost more materiel than they ever have before. So not only are they losing territory, they're losing their ability to fight as well. In addition, they lose allies. Not that the Germans' fate really depends one way or the other on their allies, but still, it's never good when you lose several hundred thousand fighting men who are allied to you. And the allies in this case, of course, Italy is out already from 1943, but the allies that leave them in the second half of 1944 are Romania and Bulgaria, which basically switched sides when the Soviets reached their territory. And you can see this desperation coming out, for example, because the Germans activate the famous Volkssturm in September 1944. So this is basically the old men. No offense, but it would kind of be the Matthias and me's of the German population, who would be, age-wise anyway, who would be activated at this time. And that's not what you want, all right? You don't want people of the age of Matthias and
They don't want us? They don't want us?
On paper, just if you're looking at the age, probably not your first choice. Let's just put it that way. The Germans do produce more stuff than they have in the past in 1944, more tanks and things like that. But everyone can see where it's going. Albert Speer, the Minister for Armament, he basically estimates, I think in September as well, that they've got about a year left, that they're going to be able to produce enough stuff to fight. So that's the general situation the Germans are in, and that is why they decide that something dramatic needs to happen.
Absolutely. So basically, you might say the war is done, isn't it? It's obvious to everybody that Germany has lost the war. And it's one of these questions that is being asked and discussed ever since 1945. Why do the Germans keep fighting? Why do they not surrender? I mean, that's another topic for another podcast. Probably the answer is, what else can you do unless you want total surrender? And obviously, they weren't ready for this yet. I mean, I'm opening a can of worms here already, so I'm putting the lid on this because this really is another podcast. But it is just not looking good for the Germans for all the reasons you have just mentioned. Men are gone, materiel is gone. They've now lost the Romanian oil fields as well, so they don't have enough oil, i.e. petrol, to drive their tanks around, which will have an impact on the planning of this particular operation. We'll talk about this in more detail later. When you look at the Allied side, you might say, well, everything is looking great, isn't it? Because, well, if Germany is losing, so things should be great for the Allies. Well, actually, far from it. We have some issues on the Eastern Front. It's basically logistics. So the Soviets are running out of steam, and you have the same in the West as well. After the breakout from Normandy, the Allies sweep through northern France, into the Netherlands, into Belgium. But now they have logistical issues as well. They simply do not have enough men and material to keep pushing into Germany. And the man and the material they have is tired. So people need a rest. The material needs to be maintained. So they've got issues as well. The reason why they don't march into Germany in the autumn of 1944 is exactly this. On top of that, another problem that you have from a logistics point of view, you only have really one deep water port you can use during the summer and early autumn of 1944, and that's Cherbourg, that's still in Normandy. The other ports are not all that great. Some of them are still in German hands. Some of these ports on the Channel coast are in German hands. One actually remains in German hands till the end of the war. That means you have to transport most of the material, for example, also of the petrol, from Normandy all the way to the front line. And there is a bit of a shuttle service that is established. The problem, of course, is you need to have vehicles that drive all that stuff, and they use petrol themselves. So for every liter of petrol that reaches the front line, they use about 5 liters to transport it. So you can see there are issues there as well. And the big game changer is Antwerp, because Antwerp is this huge, big harbor, and the Allies and the Germans know if that is seized by the Allies, can be made operational, this is a huge game changer. The Allies manage to reach that, they seize it, they take Antwerp, but they still can't use it because the Germans are still controlling the mouth of the River Schelde. So that is still cut off. So there's another problem here. So you can see all sorts of issues mainly to do with logistics, and that has implications. We're not talking about Market Garden, but Market Garden is, you might say, the embodiment of this. You have a debate in the Allied camp. Do you have an attack on a broad front? This is what Eisenhower wants. Or do you have to concentrate forces on a smaller area? That's what Montgomery says, because simply they don't have enough man and material. Market Garden, not the topic of today, but that is a defeat. So it's not looking all that good for the Allies either. They need breathing space. They need time for rest, recuperation, get their troops ready for the next big attack. So even though Germany is looking really vulnerable, the Allies also have their own issues. Not to the same degree, but there are issues there as well.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, the Canadians are assigned to capture the Scheldt estuary to free up that access to the port of Antwerp, which is supposed to then become the main hub for Allied supplies, which is much, much closer to the front, as you mentioned. I should give a little shout out to the port of Marseille, which is also useful for the Allies, but it is also quite far from the front. They're able to use it, but of course, yeah, they got to spend a lot of resources to move the stuff from there. It is, of course, a port on the Mediterranean coast of France, quite a large one. Great town, by the way. Marseille is worth a visit for any European listeners and viewers out there. So,
it also has, of course, the Foreign Legion recruiting bureau. So if you want to join the Foreign Legion, I've been there. For a moment, I was tempted to sign the dotted line, and I thought, well, maybe not. It was a school trip, long, long time ago.
You would have learned French in a hurry at that point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Actually, you understand French, don't you? Little tangent here. Okay, so you would have had a leg up on everybody else who's not only got to go through Foreign Legion training, but also learn French while doing it, which is probably not the most fun way to do it. In any case, so if you're the Germans, if we put ourselves into their shoes for one moment, you are between a rock and a hard place in East and West. You don't have a lot of options, and so I think if you're the Germans, you're trying to think, well, what can we still possibly achieve? What is doable? We're not going to go off and capture Moscow. We're not going to go off and throw the Western allies back into the English Channel. Of course, the Soviets are menacing. They're on the border in East Prussia, and they're preparing a big winter offensive, which is going to be the Vistula offensive. That's going to take them all the way into East Central Germany, let's say, not that far from Berlin. So if you're the Germans, you're looking at that as your main immediate threat that's coming. But you can't really do much to the Soviets. If you were to scrape up all your last reserves and throw them at the Soviets, well, maybe you push them back 100 kilometers, maybe you push them back 300 kilometers. But you're not going to fully defeat the Red Army with the resources that you have. And meanwhile, the Western allies are going to just march into your industrial heartland in the Ruhr in the West. So you're going to try something in the West, right? I think that's the thinking. The geographic space plays a big role in your strategic decisions, I think, because the Channel Coast makes all the difference. If you can reach the Channel Coast, if you can cut off a chunk of the Allied armies who don't have supply then, which you cannot do in the East, you cannot, unless you really encircle a huge number of Soviets, which is a lot harder to do, you don't have that opportunity because of the geography, so among other factors. So I think this is what turns the Germans' attention to the West. Some of the thinking is also, well, perhaps the Western allies might be convinced, if we hit them hard enough, to agree to some sort of half-compromise peace, which we don't think the Soviets will do for ideological reasons, right? In the German shoes, we kind of think the Allies might be more, quote-unquote, reasonable from the German point of view than the Soviets might be. And so I think these are the types of factors, the sort of big picture factors that go into the German thinking. Hey, maybe we can achieve a change in the outcome of the war, not a resounding victory of conquest, but if we can sort of force the Western Allies into a real bad military situation by cutting off part of their army, a la 1940, Dunkirk style, we can force them to not march into the homeland, basically, and then we can shift everybody to the east and see what happens with the Soviets. So I think those are sort of the underlying ideas that bring the Germans to launch the Bulge.
And this is really interesting, isn't it? Because as you've just explained, so you have very, very clear political, strategic, and other reasons, whether it's politics, it's psychology, all these things that play a role here. And it's fascinating to see the development and the genesis of this particular offensive and the planning, because it's to a large degree, it's actually Hitler says, I want something like this. The generals are very, very skeptical because they think we'll not be able to achieve a big, massive military victory here. So they prepare their smaller version of this, which will not have any strategic outcome at all. But Hitler says, no, you misunderstand. It's not only about the pure military side, but as you've just said, it's to hit the Allies in the West really hard. That will make them see sense. They will hopefully make peace, and you can then move all the troops to these. Because Hitler is, when it comes to that, even in late 1944, quite a shrewd politician and thinker. He knows that there are tensions between the Western Allies and the Eastern Allies. He knows there are tensions between the British and the Americans, and he's really trying to exploit this. And when you look at the operation itself, what is the aim? So reach Antwerp, make sure that can't be used by the Allies. It also means that you've got large Allied contingents in the back in the north. And these would be mainly British, whereas you've got the Americans to the south. So again, you're driving a wedge between these two allies. And that is all really interesting when you start unpacking this. So it's not only about pure military outcome, but using the military just as the vehicle for perhaps you might say, psychological solution here. And that, of course, leads to a political one. So Hitler, in many ways, is a disciple of Clausewitz, who, of course, said that warfare is merely the continuation of politics or policy by other means. So he's much more thinking in these bigger terms than the pure military side of things. And, of course, as you already said, you could go to the east, and the German generals, so Guderian, for example, said, we need to send everything to the east because this is where stuff is happening. But as you've explained, and as warfare and the history of warfare has shown time and time again, well, even if you defeat the Soviets there, as you mentioned, you push them back, and what's the strategic outcome? It's also interesting that by this stage, Hitler has kind of changed his view, and he says the Soviets are the much harder fighters, they're the ones who will not surrender because of ideology, because of pressures, all these things that you find there. So in many ways, he now sees the Western allies as the easier target, and this is where he can have success. And so all this put together then means that they're going to launch the operation there. There are a number of people also in the military, in the German military, and also today that say, well, that was a very silly idea to do this. They should have just stayed on the defensive. Well, basically, the consensus in 1944 is if you do that, you're just going to be overwhelmed by the enemy. So you need to hit the enemy. You have to take the offensive. You have to regain initiative. Only if you do that, then you can perhaps still turn the war around, which, of course, as we know, is ludicrous and a complete illusion. But that's the thinking that they have. So within this rather strange world of what goes on in Germany at the time and Hitler's brain, within that operation kind of even makes sense, which sounds a bit strange to us today, knowing what happens afterwards.
Yeah, I think that's one of the key elements that I hope we keep returning to sort of implicitly and explicitly in the podcast, is trying to see it from the point of view of people making the decisions at the time. In hindsight, of course, we can think all sorts of different things. In hindsight, we know about the Cold War. And so I've read some things and seen some things online about, well, obviously the Germans should have just not cared if the Western Allies marched into Western Germany. They should have just thrown everything to the east and kept the Soviets as far east as possible so that everybody would have been better off without Soviet occupation in Eastern Germany, for example, or wherever. Hindsight is 2020. Hitler and his ministers are not worried about a future Cold War and whether some Germans in that Cold War might live under communist occupation. They are worried about regime survival now. And that's the sort of driving, that's the assumption they make. There is no assumption that, well, once we're gone, Germans will be better off if we do X, Y, or Z. This is not the thinking at all. It's, we are going to remain in power and we want to then have the best situation for that, right? So I think the Cold War hindsight seeps into some of the discussion, some of our popular perceptions of this kind of period of the war, let's say. The other interesting theme, sorry, I was just going to say the other interesting theme, and we can go back to that one if you like, Matthias, is this consistent underestimation of the British and American and Canadian and Australian will to fight in the Second World War. The Japanese do it at Pearl Harbor, right? And then they suffer the consequences of that. And then even here, you see the Germans, essentially German leadership, doing it again. And it never happens. It doesn't work out that way. The English-speaking countries, for lack of a better descriptor here, have the will to fight in this war. And it, from the beginning to the end, it does not change, it does not go away, no matter what their fortunes are on the battlefields. And yet their enemies consistently underestimate that time and time again. And I think that's interesting too.
It is very interesting. I think these two aspects that you mentioned, they can be linked because all boils down to democracy, doesn't it? So the Nazi regime, of course, just like the Japanese, but like fascism as well, doesn't really hold democracy in high regard. So, well, that's for weaklings. It's a plutocracy, as I would call it, plutocratie. So that is the reign of the money and the few of the wealthy. So the money runs the world. That's basically it. There is an interesting piece of paper, I've got the original somewhere, notes written down by a German NS Führungsoffizier. So he's basically the political instructor, which the Germans introduced in the second stage of the war, based on what they saw on the Eastern Front, the commissars they have in the Soviet army. And so this guy, it's a bit before what we are talking about, so it's during Normandy, and he talks about why it is important to fight against the Anglo-Americans. And he says, well, the plutocracy of the Wall Street is just as bad as communism from Moscow. It's the same thing. They're just as bad. And of course, what you also find then here is the general feeling, again, coming back to what you said, with this idea of hindsight. Well, Americans and British all friends during the Cold War and these things. That was not the case in 1944, 1945. There's actually quite a bit of hatred against these nations as well. Just think about the bombing campaign. you've got tens and thousands, hundreds of thousands of German civilians being killed. That is, to the people at that particular time, that's absolutely awful. And of course you keep fighting because they're killing civilians. Now, of course, you can talk about why that happens and the bombing campaign. There's another podcast, a mini-series here, I think. But that is also the general feeling. And this whole idea that, we need to open in the West and let them come in so the Soviets don't come. This is really something you see from the spring of 1945 onwards, March, April, early May, when everyone sees, well, you know what, this is over anyway. Very different in 1944. It's also, of course, where you're beginning to hit German soil. Before that, in 1944, the main first big city is Aachen. Again, we're not talking about that in detail, but this changes things. So Aachen is seized by the Allied forces. This changes things. You're now fighting for your own home territory. That has a psychological impact. And talking about psychology, linking that with the military aspect, when you say, well, they simply don't see these guys fighting hard. It's because I would say the Americans and also the British are fighting in a much cleverer way. So they're not really about putting lots of troops there, fixing bayonets and charging the enemy, which looks very heroic, but also causes lots of casualties. They fight in a much cleverer way. When you read the German Army Action reports, and we know this, of course, because that's the way they want to fight the Americans and the British as well, it's to do with firepower, because that means you inflict casualties on the other side, but you can keep your own casualties down. That is a very clever way of fighting. The Germans see this as a not particular heroic, honorable way of fighting, which is really kind of silly. And the Germans have to do it in a different way because they simply don't have that many guns and tanks and air power. But that's why they say, well, they're not fighting very hard, but actually they're inflicting casualties. And as you said, well, they're winning, aren't they? In 1944, they're on the borders of Germany. So even if you say, well, they're not particularly hard fighters, well, they're doing something right. Otherwise, the Germans would have driven them back into the sea and in Normandy. And that didn't happen. So a bit of lessons learned might not have been a bad idea on the German side.
Agreed. And yeah, there are a few YouTube commenters out there on the internet who could do with a reminder in that direction. In any case, yes, I think that ideological aspect as well that you were just explaining a little bit further helps explain this. I think we talk a lot about German ideas about communism and its association in their minds with Jews, but the Anglo-American type of capitalism, which is a bit different than the German Nazi sort of state-influenced capitalism that they had, they associate that with the Jews as well. So there's an equally visceral part of their anti-Semitic ideology that can be applied and was applied to the Anglo-Americans as well, just as they did to the Soviets. Perhaps not quite to the same extent in some ways, but it's much more common when you look at the propaganda of the time than you might think from the proportion and type of propaganda that is more common now, I think, in popular representations of history. I feel like more of the visceral German anti-Soviet propaganda is present in our current online world than of the anti-American and anti-British stuff. And it's also anti-Semitic as well. I think to your point about how the Americans and British and Canadians in this case in Northwest Europe fight, I think that also has something to do with ideology, which is interesting. Now we're on another little tangent, but you'll forgive us, listeners and viewers, because you don't want to kill needlessly, let's say, or frivolously, your voters' relatives, because people are going to be upset. And it's a part of I think, in general, a democracy is more likely to be cautious with the lives of its citizens than a non-democracy. Not to mention that of course, German ideology has a part of a sort of death cult. It's great to die for the cause and for the fatherland and all of this. That's not necessarily totally new. In the 19th century, First World War, people said, we should die for our nation and things like that. But when it comes to actually doing that and ordering large numbers of people to do that, I think democracy is much more likely to think long and hard before putting someone in harm's way. Not that they don't do that sometimes, but I think if you compare the German and Anglo-American democratic ways of thinking, it's kind of logical that they would also try to fight differently, including, of course, the resources that they have. If you have enough firepower to husband your own manpower, you're going to do it, militarily speaking, as well.
Yeah, so let's continue with that tangent for a moment. We're completely moving away from the Bulge here, aren't we? But
we'll come back. We'll come back.
Exactly. Our listeners and viewers know that we do this now. And actually, we've been encouraged a number of times in the comments that by people saying they like the tangent. So don't encourage us.
It's your own fault.
Otherwise it will only get worse. It will only get worse. But you're absolutely right. I mean, there's a big difference, a big discrepancy, you might say, between what the Germans and perhaps the Soviets do and what the Western allies. Well, a relatively broad brush now, but let's stick with that too. And you talked about democracy. I think it's absolutely right. It's the understanding of a state. What is a state? What is the right of the state? What can the state demand from you? I mean, in the German case, and now it's getting really, really strange here and complete tangent, you can go back all the way about 200 years at that particular time. And you go back to the days of Hegel, who is the great philosopher, and he's the great philosopher of the state. And he talks about the ideal state. And the ideal state, without going into too much detail now, for him is Prussia, is the embodiment of Prussia. So the state, a strong state that can make demands on you. And demands mean also, well, you have to fight, which is the idea also, that's interesting, is the idea of conscription. So the citizen is the born defender of the state. That's a Scharnhorst quote from the Prussian reforms of 1813 to 15. But as you say, you use people in a different way. When you go to Normandy, I might have mentioned that before in a different podcast, I can't remember. We've already made far too many. There's a German anti-aircraft battery, and when the concrete was still wet, someone went there and basically just drew in it. He was obviously bored with his finger. And so he drew a big eagle with a swastika, and underneath he wrote, "Germany must live even if we die." So that is a quote from a very famous poem from the First World War. Everybody in those days knew. That's something that to us sounds very alien, because we have the idea of the value of the individual. In other societies, whether it was Germany or the Soviet Union or other nations today, that is very different. The individual is not important. Important is the survival of the people and the state, the Volk in German. So it's a very different approach. And of course, what you also find, particularly in the British case, is Churchill's realization that if we fight in a different way, we might win the war. But we'll have such heavy casualties that we simply will not play a role anywhere on the world stage after 1945. So they're also trying to preserve manpower. So all these things are coming together, and all these things are basically deciding the planning for this particular operation.
Right. And that is a perfect segue, because I think it would make sense for us to talk a bit about the plan for the operation before we wind up today's episode and then get into the details perhaps in the next episode. So about the German plan, what are you going to do now that you've come to this strategic conclusion and Hitler basically says this is what we want to do? How are you going to do it? Well, the idea is that they're going to go through their old hunting grounds of the Ardennes, this thickly forested region, basically in the corner where there's like Belgium, Luxembourg, and France, where they more or less meet. There's a hilly forested region, the Ardennes. This is where the Germans kind of catch the French flat-footed in 1940 and send tanks through there, which the French weren't fully expecting. So the idea is you send a tank force through there. It's going to be able to smash through the relatively thinly manned American lines in the area. And then it's going to, well, there's an important river barrier we shouldn't leave out. So you cross the Meuse River, and then you turn north towards the Channel coast, and that's where you go for Antwerp. And once you reach there, you've cut off a bunch of Americans, all the Canadians, and pretty much all the Brits to the north of that, stuck in part of Belgium and mostly in the Netherlands. And that's when you can hopefully force, from the German point of view, force your political goals on the enemy. However, this is a big ask for what the German army can do at the time. And I think you mentioned earlier in the podcast that some of the generals are not very pleased with this idea because they think it's too ambitious. In fact, Gerd von Rundstedt, after the war, so take that context into account. After the war, he says, of the planning for the Bulge. If we had reached the Meuse, we should have got down on our knees and thanked God, let alone try to reach Antwerp. So you get the idea that it's an ambitious thing. In any case, there are some, let's say, vulnerabilities in this plan, but I don't know if you want to add a little more detail to the plan in general. So you punch through, you turn to the channel, and you take Antwerp. But of course, there's a little bit more to it than that.
There's a bit more to it, but I mean that sums it up quite nicely, doesn't it? Because that's the idea. And what is really interesting is that you're having this, what you might call this operational plan, because later on we're going to look at the numbers involved. They're actually not particularly large for an operation like this, which is supposed to have a strategic outcome. When you compare this to perhaps even France 1940, you already mentioned it, that's where the Germans go through the Ardennes as well, or look at all the other big battles that you have, particularly in the second half of the war, the numbers are much, much higher. So numbers here are quite low. So of course that's the embodiment of the German weakness at that particular stage, but it is a huge gamble, isn't it? Putting this strategic political hope onto a relatively small number of troops. I mean, we're still looking at, roughly speaking, 400, at the beginning, 400,000 men. But by the standards of the day, that's not a huge army that you're setting off in this, what the Germans call the Ardennen offensive. So that's also the term. So Battle of the Bulge is very much the term in the English-speaking world. In Germany, that's not known as that at all. In German, it's called the Ardennen offensive, which of course tells you the Ardennen are in there. So that again gives you the link. Which is also interesting, moving a little bit away from the plan itself for 1 second, just because I mentioned the term, is the terminology that the Germans use. And here's another nice tangent. There we go. See how far I can stretch this one.
We barely finished the last one.
It's the German term for this operation. The code name is Wacht am Rhein, which translates as Watch on the Rhine. And that is, you might say, it's quite cleverly chosen because that sends out, it's some sort of defensive measure, a defensive operation that the Germans are doing because you're protecting the River Rhine. So that's why they chose this one. There is, however, another reason why they chose this, and this is to do with the term Wacht am Rhein, which is a very famous German nationalistic song that everybody knew at the time. It comes from the 1840s when you had some struggle between Germany and France over the Rhine border that goes on for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so they then come up with the song, The Watch on the Rhine, which basically you might say becomes a bit one of the unofficial German national anthems of that time. Because interesting, up to 1918, Germany as a country does not have a national anthem. There isn't one. So quite often people sing the Wacht am Rhein. Do you want me to sing it? I'm not quite sure my singing is as outstandingly poor. Probably not. Yeah, probably not. I might give that a miss.
You can all find it on YouTube.
I might give that a miss.
If you'd like,
yeah, it's probably better. It's probably much, much better. Exactly. So that becomes a very famous song about bringing Germany together to defend yourself against, in that case, as they would have seen it, the evil French who are trying to take over the Rhine area. The other, that's now the real tangent here, the other kind of unofficial national anthem, of course, is das Deutschlandlied. In those days, Deutschland, Deutschland über alles, which most people probably know, which was not the national anthem. If they did have a national anthem up to 1918, it was Heil dir im Siegerkranz, which, interesting enough, has got the same melody as God Save the King. So there was a football match not long ago, and I think it was England playing, I think it was Liechtenstein, if I'm not mistaken, because they still have the old national anthem. So the English football fans were very confused when the same tune was played twice. So that was actually quite funny to see, I thought. But that's also that in 1944, just these words, they mean something to Germans. So it's basically everyone will basically get together behind this great idea. We're now defending German territory, the homeland, the fatherland, even if that means you're on the strategic defense, but you're now lashing out again, you're hitting the enemy operationally. So that's also to do with different levels of war and different thinking. I think that also plays a role in this whole idea of this operation here as well.
Yeah, it's got that cultural significance that would resonate for purposes of morale, essentially, right? You want to underpin, not undermine, but underpin, strengthen morale, and it's a form of propaganda in a way, light propaganda, let's say, to do it that way. However, Operation Wacht am Rhein starts out with some built-in
By the
challenges,
way,
let's say.
If I may just say, if you say Wacht
Yes.
am Rhein with an Austrian accent, it doesn't work.
Doesn't work. Not allowed. I get a fine. I get a fine by fax from the German bureaucracy of patriotic sayings. I cannot speak German without an Austrian accent. It just doesn't happen anymore. I don't know. It's been too long. In any case, there were a few prominent Germans at the time who would have said those words with an Austrian accent.
That is very true. That is very true.
I digress yet again. So the Watch on the Rhine operation has some built-in weak points, let's say, and that's being kind. So one of the things that happens is this whole planning process is rushed, obviously. You're not working with the luxury of time here like the planners were before the attack against France, like the planners were before the attack against the Soviet Union. They're doing things on a shoestring. And this leads to some compromises, let's say, that they would never make and that good military sense would cause you to never make. For example, the Germans underestimate the strength of the Americans in the area, even though the Americans don't have that many men in the Ardennes region. They only have, at the start of the battle, about 80,000 men, so they're quite outnumbered by the Germans that are going to attack them. Still, they have oodles of men in the area that could be brought in as reinforcements. And the Germans underestimate that capability. Fuel is a big problem because in general, now these estimates are a bit tricky in detail, but I'll throw one out anyway. In general, they only have enough fuel with them, the Germans do, for about 40 plus kilometers of advance. However, they need to advance nearly 200 kilometers in a day to reach the Meuse River. So this is extremely ambitious. Not only are you expecting, well, we're going to be able to break through and advance this far, but we have to do it by capturing the enemy's fuel supplies on the ground. Now that is extreme. It's one of those situations where your plan requires every single thing possible to go exactly right in order for it to work. And in military planning, that is never a good idea. To throw another number out there, the Germans have something like 15,000 tons of ammunition brought up, but they need about 1,200 tons every day to keep this offensive up. So that means you've got about 12 days worth of ammunition prepared with potential Allied counterattacks, with the time it would take for them to accept that they can't get out of that trap if your plan works. You're going to have to fight for more than 12 days. And you don't have enough, if you're the Germans, you don't have enough vehicles to bring up the supplies fast enough. They have a huge motorization problem. We see propaganda films with tanks here and tanks there and tigers and panthers and everybody else at the Battle of the Bulge, but they don't have trucks. Or they have some, but not enough, right? They use 40 times as many horses during the Battle of the Bulge as they do trucks. They're making little convoys of like towed, whatever it might be. Let's say it's a Nebelwerfer rocket launcher. They'll tow 2 or 3 behind one truck because they don't have the trucks to do it. So you're already mega sort of hamstrung, even in the planning process.
Absolutely. So when you look at this, you might say, well, who came up with this idea? Who thought that this would be a good idea? As I said, in warfare, you always have to keep things simple. And they are just really putting all their money on this one card. And even if you're lucky enough to capture all of these petrol dumps, it's not even said that you can use all that petrol, because German tanks use petrol at that particular time. In the Allied camp, it's a bit of a mix. Most of them, for example, the Shermans, would use petrol as well, but you have some of them that are actually using diesel engines. So that makes it even more complex and more complicated. So it's really all done an absolute shoestring. The other factor that you also have is the weather. You launch an attack, you launch an offensive, you would normally say it would be a great idea to have good weather because that means you can use the Air Force to support the ground troops as they advance. This is the task of the German Luftwaffe during the entire war. Support the army as they go through the enemy forces, smash through them, and achieve whatever they're supposed to achieve. Here, they're doing the exact opposite. They're waiting for the bad weather period because they know that they no longer have superiority, not even equality in the air. So again, that shows you that, you might say, the desperation on the German side. The realization that they're actually realistically too weak to really achieve what they set out to achieve, to turn things around. But as we already said earlier, what else? That's their thinking. What else can you do? You can either surrender, or you can just sit and wait. If you just sit and wait, Allied numerical superiority sooner or later is going to crush you. So take the offensive, put all your money on the one card and go for it. But just these examples show you how desperate everything really is in the German camp at that particular stage.
And we will get into how this plan plays out, folks, in our next episode. So we've started our little Battle of the Bulge content here on the podcast. We hope that you enjoyed it. Today, we talked about the strategic context. We went off on some unbelievably obscure tangents, but I hope that we brought it back to the plan, the German plan for this operation, this famous operation towards the end of the war, and some of the built-in flaws, which we will get into in the next episode. So, thank you all for watching and for listening. If you liked what you heard today and you want to support the podcast, of course, Matthias and I and the Battle Guide team would be happy if you decide to become a podcast supporter. You can do that by going to our website at bothsidesofthewire.com. If you become a supporter, you get access to even more weird tangents that are not publicly available with our exclusive content in the War Room. You can even get a free trial for that, a 1-month trial, if you use the code Deep Dark Woods, all one word. What are some of the recent War Rooms we've done? I think you analyzed a movie, The Tiger.
Yes,
was that the name of the
Tiger.
movie? Yeah.
Yep.
So you get from a German army officer, you get an analysis of a movie about a German tank, more or less. In addition, I think the last one I did on the War Room was about a little known but fascinating assassination of a high-ranking German official by Belarusian partisans. So that's just a little hint of the kind of stuff you can get at the War Room at bothsidesofthewire.com. That's it for today, and we'll see you in the next episode. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening.
Say, Jesse, late 1944, what is the situation like on the Western Front?
Well, well, that's a great start. Well, all right.
There was someone who said he liked the old man throat clearing at one stage in one of the comments. So there we go. That should become a feature now.
Lovely. Being an old man's already a feature. The throat clearing is a bonus. Anyway, we'll snip all that.